Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are delighted to be here with all of you, celebrating The World Cannot Give by Tara Isabella Burton. It's got a beautiful cover right here. We are joined as well by Sarah Rose. And I'll introduce Sarah Rose first. Sarah uses they, them pronouns and is a journalist, musician, and advocate originally from Atlanta, Georgia. Their reporting has been featured on NPR, PBS NewsHour, The Advocate, and Georgia Public Broadcasting. As a musician, they are the vocalist of the rock group Sarah and the Safe Word, signed to Take This to Heart, records, and distributed by Warner Music. They have a ton of albums. You can check them out on Bandcamp and anywhere else where music is sold. So welcome, Sarah. We're glad you're here and glad to have a hometown musician in the house. It's always great to have Atlanta folks with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And the person of the hour tonight is Tara Isabella Burton. Her debut novel was Social Creature, which was named a Best Book of the Year by the New York Times, Vulture, and The Guardian. And her first book of nonfiction was called Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World. And it was praised by Tim Shriver as the most thoughtful analysis of our current spiritual crisis anywhere. That came out in 2020. Her fiction and nonfiction have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Granta, and more. She received a doctorate in theology from Trinity College, Oxford, where she was a Clarendon Scholar in 2017. And certainly these themes run through all of your work, so this book is no exception. Lots of themes about mysticism and charismatic people and cults and all kind of good stuff. So I cannot wait to dig right in. I want to encourage folks who are watching at home, you are welcome to ask questions. You're welcome to shout out where you're watching from in the chat, or you can just kick back and enjoy and listen to these two smart people talk. So congratulations, Tara. We're so happy that this book is already a success, and we know lots more folks are going to be excited to get their hands on it soon. So without further ado, welcome to you both. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. It's a delight to be here.
Of course.
I was thinking about starting with a reading, which is what I've been doing, sort of into the abyss of the screen, which is somewhat strange. I think I've never quite gotten used to the Zoom reading. But I like to start at the beginning and to give all of you listening at home a sense of who Laura Stearns is and what she wants as we go into talking about the book. This is the opening. Laura cries easily. She cries at poems when the slant rhymes surprise you. She cries at old movies where people are in love but can't acknowledge it for self-abnegatingly heroic reasons like being married or having to lead the French resistance. And she cries at the lonely light of early mornings. She cries when she pieces together the etymologies of words, and she cries when people sing the exact right harmony and their voices loudest so that she hears only one perfect, unearthly sound. Laura even cried in the middle of history once, the time they were reading about how people in the Middle Ages who made art depicted human beings as ordinary sons, but angels as impossibly big, like houses or towers. And the textbook author said it was because people in the Middle Ages really did see angels all around them. Well, scientifically, sure, but psychologically. And the notion that once upon a time a person could just look around and see angels everywhere struck Laura as so impossibly beautiful that she erupted into weeping, and then had to lie and tell everybody it was menstrual cramps, because as soft and susceptible as Laura Stearns is, even she knows that in the real world you can't go around crying about angels unless you want people to think you're one of those nuts who stands outside the Bellagio with picket signs that say the end is near. It's not that Laura doesn't know she's too sensitive. She knows her parents, her teachers, her school counselor all call her young for her age. Laura is 16. She feels so old. But one day, they tell her, she will have to develop that necessary carapace that other people seem to be born with by default, the one that means things no longer make you cry. Only then, Laura thinks, she wouldn't love things so deeply. She wouldn't love Sebastian Webster the way she does. She doesn't know who she is, not loving him. Sebastian Oliver Webster knew things. He understood about angels, about heroes, about lattices of voices. He understood about beauty and meaning and about world history, which he always capitalizes. He understood about green morning light and also about slant rhymes. All before them is full of them, hidden in his prose. And every time Laura rereads it, she starts crying on page 17 and doesn't stop until she slammed it shut. Laura has read all before them 15 times. It's the ending that gets her. It's dusk, late in term time. A spring storm's blowing in along the coast. It's 1936. Robert Lawrence, he's the character Webster based on himself, walks into the St. Dunstan's chapel. He tries to pray. Most of the plot is resolved by this point. Gus has already had his affair with his headmaster's wife, and the boys have all dared each other to jump off Barnum Cliff, and Robert Lawrence has already beaten up poor Shrimpy Masterson in the Falmouth Woods. And it's not that Robert's a bad person. Laura always has trouble explaining this part. It's just that Robert wants so much and so deeply. And more than anything, Robert wants this experience he calls a shipwreck of the soul, even though Webster never explains exactly what this means. Laura isn't sure what it means either, although the words together make her heart seize. But anyway, it's the only thing Robert wants. And it's all Robert can't have. Not that he doesn't search. He tries drugs, religion, sex. He falls in love with this townie named Peggy. He breaks Shrimpy Masterson's nose in the woods, and Laura has to skip that scene whenever she rereads it because it hurts too much to get through. But anyway, the ending. It's dusk. It's 1936, and the sky is splitting open. Robert's still trapped in what Webster keeps calling the whole sclerotic modern world, where nothing means anything, where everything, capital G, great, or capital P, pure, or capital W, capital H, world historical. Webster's styling, only now Laura uses it too, that was ever going to happen. It happened already, long ago, where nobody's soul ever gets dashed on rocks. And Robert is sitting there in the chapel, his head in his hands, looking up at this stained glass mosaic of the Virgin Mary as Stella Maris. Her lantern aloft like she's some kind of lighthouse, but anyway, Robert's staring up at her, taking the feeling, completely feeling it. And then all of a sudden, he hears little Shrimpy Masterson say. Webster leaves this part ambiguous. That's his. He doesn't tell us if Robert finds God, or if he does, what kind of God he finds, or whether the thing that finally breaks Robert open is supposed to be Shrimpy himself, or the sound of the Magnificat, or the sight of the storm-split sky darkening through Mary's lantern. But anyway, Robert experiences at last the shipwreck of the soul he spent the whole book looking for. And finally, Robert gets it. He falls to his knees. It came to him at last, Webster writes, the truth he had always known, within himself, unvoiced. He realized, and Laura is convinced that this is the single most beautiful phrase in the English language. The rocks and the harbor are one. And 2 pages later, Robert sets off on a stolen boat into sunrise, and even though Webster doesn't tell us what happens to him, Laura likes to imagine that he ends up how Webster ended up in real life, stealing away from St. Dunstan's one May midnight in 1937, getting baptized by some Irish Catholic priest in Boston, talking his way into a berth on a transatlantic freighter to go fight in the Spanish Civil War, dying on a battlefield 6 months later, leaving behind nothing but a handwritten manuscript of such wild-eyed genius that 80 years later, Laura feels sure he is the only person in the world who could ever understand her. Not that Laura experienced anything she could confidently describe as a shipwreck of the soul, nor does she know exactly how she'll be able to tell when she does. She knows only that she, like Robert Lawrence, wants to have one more than anything in the world, and that the closest she's ever gotten is reading all before them for the very first time. Laura wonders often about what Sebastian Webster's shipwreck was like. She wonders whether it came quickly, like a thunderclap, or gradually, like dawn. She wonders whether once it came, he wrote the whole novel in a single feverish week, ablaze with certainty, or whether he wrestled over every word, the way Laura wrestles whenever she tries to explain herself to people that she knows. She wonders whether he knew, running off from St. Dunstan's under the cover of moonlight, that he was doomed to die on the battlefield, or whether it came as a shock to him when some Spanish soldier bayoneted him in the back. She wonders if you can have the shipwreck of the soul in a place like Henderson, Nevada, or in a time like the present, or if you have to be lucky enough to live in a place and a time where people are fighting world historical battles you can die in. She wonders if you can have a shipwreck without dying. Maybe, she thinks, once you have one, death doesn't scare you anymore. Thank you, all of you out there I cannot see. Let's take it from there.
Yeah. Well, Tara, thank you for having me for this Q&A. I really appreciate it, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Yeah, it's so nice to see you virtually as well as
virtually. I know, it's great. One thing I wanted to lead our questions off with was something I noticed right off the bat was your last book, Social Creature, took place in New York City. Really busy, social, vibrant place. This is in Maine, and I thought that the contrast between the two locations was really interesting. I've spent time in both, and I know how different those two worlds can be. What made you want to take yourself as a narrator out of this city and put yourself somewhere a little bit colder and a little bit more north?
Oh man. Well, I mean, I knew for a long time I'd wanted to write a boarding school book, and I'd been to boarding school myself in New Hampshire in my case, and I did not particularly enjoy the experience. But something that I was so fascinated by was the way in which being like taken away from real life, which is what boarding school does, and sort of drop down among a bunch of like book smart but emotionally completely messed up overachieving teenagers kind of creates a very particular world at a very particular intensity. And I love writing about New York, and I loved writing about it in Social Creature, but one of the things that New York does both so well and sort of for ill is it kind of comes at you, and you go out and into the street, a million things happen and overwhelm you, and what you're thinking about is the moment and how you are in the moment and how you're being perceived in the moment. And Social Creature was about that kind of paranoia. And for this book, I wanted to write something kind of slower and softer about what it is to fall in love and to want transcendence, and to be able to take characters out of the real world or out of certain kinds of distractions, gave them the space to kind of go down particular rabbit holes for their relationships to get intense and unhealthy in ways that like couldn't necessarily happen if these kids were like coming home from school and their parents were asking like what they had for lunch today. And
right.
So it was really important to be removed. And increasingly, I did not go to boarding school in the water, although I have in other parts of my life lived by the water. But I really loved I have a soft spot for the sea and for the ocean, and that became more a part of the like psychological landscape of sort of an increasingly gothic novel as that went on.
Right. Talking on that psychological landscape, you mentioned love and transcendence. Have you learned a better idea of what love is? Did your perspective on what love is change when you were writing this novel at all?
Oh man, that's a great question. I think it did actually. I mean, I don't know whether sort of it changed and thus the book changed, or writing the book helped me see it better. But something that is so formative for Laura, our protagonist, for all the characters, is a desire to just completely give themselves over to something else. And it's something that becomes a kind of passion in and of itself that starts to divorce itself from the object. Laura wants a shipwreck of the soul. She wants to just completely worship someone. And other characters, Virginia, who this girl that she sort of becomes an acolyte of, kind of is herself fascinated by intensity for the sake of intensity. And what gets lost in that is a kind of authenticity. You know, these are two, whatever you want to say about them, about their relationship, these are two human beings coming to know one another. Neither one of them is a supernatural being, much though Virginia, I think, would like to be. And I think that increasingly I've become convinced that that something that like a crush can do that like real love can't do is be completely total, in part because it stops you from seeing the other person involved as a human being. And the people, sort of the moments of real love of the book, as opposed to moments of devotion or sort of a cultic love, are moments when these two people see each other as humans. But unfortunately, well, for our characters, and perhaps fortunately for a Gothic and melodramatic plot, those moments are few and far between.
Right. I think one thing I took away from it is there a message that you want to have readers take away about faith, about whether or not it's religion, but just faith in a broad scope, whether it's faith in love, faith in a higher power, faith in other people that they surround themselves with? Was there something that you really wanted to have people take away from the reading experience with this?
Absolutely. I think that what I wanted most was a sense that we are, as human beings, people, like, one of the things that makes us human is our hunger for something we don't really understand. And that one of the ways in which that hunger manifests itself is the way in which we love people. And sometimes that love can be good or pure, and sometimes that love can be a desire to succumb for the sake of succumbing, or kind of like, it's like kind of like when you want to go on a roller coaster because you like want to have some feelings that are right, separate from actually another person. And I think that one of the convictions that like I came to in writing, and that I kind of wanted to argue for, was that whatever happens to us when we love someone or fall in love with someone, whatever happens to us when we're trying to find something more, those things are related. And you can call one of them faith and one of them erotic desire. You can, those are sort of easy words you can stick on them, but I'm not even sure that they boil down to that. Something that I was very keen to do is to avoid, I think that there's a lot of work, very good work, on kind of religion and repression. And certainly there's one version of the story, or one version of this novel, the version in the head of the character Isabel, who understands the relationships between his characters in this way, as this being, our one of our protagonists, Virginia, is someone who is repressed because of her religion. And if she only could just sort of get past her repression, she could be happy. And that's a narrative that I think, at least in the story of this book, is incomplete. I think every character who has a narrative about what's going on is incomplete. No one quite gets it right. And whatever's going on with Virginia, she is repressed, and she is using the language and rhetoric of religion to kind of actively pursue a kind of repression that she's not from a religious family. This is something she's chosen for herself. Whatever she's looking for is a decision she's making for herself. And I wanted that precisely to complicate a narrative of straightforward sort of guilt or shame. That's there, but I wanted whatever is happening with these characters to be a little more complicated, and a little more complicated.
A little more complicated, maybe a little bit more willing to show their scars and flaws in a way that feels very raw and I don't want to say poetic, but it feels like the love and the emotion and the interaction between these characters is right there on the page, and it feels like in every page you sort of see how they're feeling about everything all at once. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Certainly being an ex-theater kid. These are all a certain kind of. They're not all theater kids per se, but I think there is that particular way of being confused and like smart, but also kind of messed up teenager.
Yeah, the world's coming at us all at once, at every moment, all the time. Right.
And you're trying to figure it out. And something that was so like important and formative in thinking about that was, all of these characters are trying to work out what's going on, and they're all so flawed that, like, of course, none of them are able to have authentic, erotic, romantic, even experiences of friendship. Like, they just can't have healthy relationships because well, they're teenagers, and also because they are like have their own particular flaws. And something that I think is a challenge there is wanting to kind of love your characters and be like, these are, Virginia's not exactly a good person, and yet
Right.
all of these people are like worthy of love, and all of these people are, human beings with certain kinds of sort of dignity and passion, and yet they're also like do awful things, and some more awful than others, sure, but right. There's a way in which I kept sort of wanting to come back to the sense that in trying to find something more, there's got to be some good there, and
Yeah.
whether or not they're all coming to it in a broken or misshapen way, whether or not they're kind of getting in their own way psychologically, spiritually, romantically. I think it's a question particularly for Laura that like Laura has to ask herself. It starts with the question of like, can I still read this book by this guy who turns out to be kind of awful, and ends with, can I still love the memory of my friend who has done something awful? And I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit of an idealist or an optimist, but for me, it was important just to kind of hint to a reader that whatever the characters were looking for is worth looking for, even though it takes everyone into such a dark place.
Sure. Yeah, I guess touching on that, you talked about trying to find love in these characters, even when they do things that might be appalling at times. Have any of these characters stuck with you past the point of you finishing this book? Do you still live with them in your head at all? Are there any that are still coming out?
It's Virginia. Obviously, Virginia is my favorite character I've ever written. I hope she's not my favorite character I ever will write, but I can't even imagine at this point. Because precisely, she was not even supposed to be a main character in this book. Like when I started writing this book, 2015, she was a minor character.
How did she weave herself into the main plot? I mean, how did that work in your head?
The sort of the Bonnie and Clyde story, and I don't want to spoil it for readers, but there's a kind of Bonnie and Clyde narrative that in this version sort of ends the book. And originally, the first draft of this book was told in a flashback, and it began with this sort of violent event, which was actually quite different in the original version. But it was a story of a journalist trying to figure out like what had happened, and then various versions. First, it was a journalist figuring out what had happened. Then it was a student journalist who was a student of the school, and none of these were quite working. But in each case, the characters who had kind of committed this crime were not physically present in the book because they were only there in flashback. But one of the people who was physically present was the ex-girlfriend or the girlfriend who had been abandoned, who was Virginia. And she starts out as this sort of obsessive, overachieving character who is torn between being devastated as what happened and being angry and being like insulted that she was not asked to come along. And that sort of tension of her intensity, she kept taking over the book. And suddenly the emotional arc with her was the most important part. And then I think it was my agent. I was having lunch with my agent, was reading a draft that like wasn't quite working. My agent said something like, I really thought that like Virginia was going to be behind it all because she clearly is the most interesting part of the book. And I sort of laughed. I was like, isn't that funny that oh my God, that's the book. And thus rewrote it all. And I think for me that what I don't know if I'm like Virginia. I think there's a part of me that is, a very part of me that I'm not particularly fond of, but the desire for like intensity for the sake of intensity, the hunger for something that's like the most thing. The word that Virginia uses is hideousness. Like, ooh, it makes me feel freaked out. That's how I know I like it. And there's a version of that like I think many of us are drawn to, and whether we're like watching a horror movie or what have you. But there is a version of Virginia wants to be strong enough and like badass enough to just like countenance and live through the worst possible assessments of what it means to be human in this way. She's like, someone at my event last night was like, oh, it's like Nietzsche, huh? And I was like, oh yeah,
a little bit.
Sure. That is, she thinks of herself as this like extremely like Christian person, but there is a kind of very strong like 19th century Nietzschean sort of strand to her actual thinking that
that makes sense. I'm curious, when you have a pivot like that, when you're writing, when you realize that a character is about to take a presence that you weren't expecting, are you comfortable with those kind of pivots, or did you have to kind of learn to like go along with that writing, or was it just like I'm going to go along with this, I'm going to see where this character takes me?
By the time that I was writing it, the latter, because I think I learned about myself. I hate writing first drafts. Like I hate looking at a blank piece of paper and getting something down. Yeah. Luckily, I don't do very much of it because most of my process is rewriting, and I rewrite really heavily. I basically rewrite every draft of every book from scratch. So The World Cannot Give went through like 7 different drafts from scratch, three after like the book sold in its current form. Right. And one of the things I really like about that is like once I kind of have written a draft, it is so much easier for me to like write a new, better, different draft. And so every time there's a big change, it's exciting because the feeling I hate most as a writer is like when you're wading through mud and you're like, this draft isn't quite working, but I kind of have to finish it just to have it done. But I know everything's going to be changed. And then when you're like, oh, I figured out what isn't working and what needs to be different. For me, right. That once that light bulb goes off, it's so much easier for me to write. And like, I don't mind throwing out 100,000 words.
Right.
Just to get to that moment of like, no, I see. And it used to frustrate me, obviously. Like, it is extremely frustrating to throw out work. But I think that the more I came from a theater background before going into academia. I thought I wanted to be a director. I had a spot at mime school, which I never took up.
Mime school sounds fun.
Well, yeah, I called the cock in Paris. I could have been a mime.
That's pretty cool.
More a lucrative path of academic theology. But one of the things that I love about theater is like the way in which the rehearsal process means you just like do it again but better, do it again but better, like do it again, but this time like you're in a French accent, like do it again, right. But this time your character's motivation is this, and that thinking of like every run through is a playful chance to experiment. Really stuck with me, and so I love writing multiple drafts of the same thing, and like multiple bad drafts because I don't really agonize over a language until much later in the process. But it's just fun to see like, oh, this works, and it was true of Virginia. It's actually true of Isabel because Isabel started out as a minor character too.
Yeah,
and got like more and more and more important to the book every draft because she was just one of the characters I like best. So.
Makes sense. You know, the through line of this with faith and religion, you know, faith is not always congruent, I think, with modern feminist messages all the time. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious what your takeaway was when you really dove into the discussions and ruminations on religion in this book. Not to assume you're a feminist, but I would assume you probably are. How did you reconcile sort of those big questions about faith with maybe the modern feminist narrative and what you took away from it?
So one of the starting point for me, and I think a little caveat is, you know, I'm particularly lucky, and like I was the kind of faith that I was raised in, like in a super like liberal New York environment, was like super like for me like Christmas and Easter, and also like I never knew a church that was not like super queer affirming and like super progressive. I think I was 10 when I found went on AOL.com and found out that this was not like normative. So
the normative, yeah.
A particular perspective, but for me, what it was interesting to me about, and this for me, this is an extremely queer book of like where pretty much all like almost all the characters are somewhere within the queer umbrella,
right?
And what I kind of the starting point of as a sort of point of commonality, I think, between these two narratives that come up in the book repeatedly are characters understanding themselves as queer. And characters understanding themselves as either religious or interested in faith in a particular way. And the commonality for me was the sense of alienation from a world presented to them. That like this world and like the world there was a character, the one heterosexual couple we sort of see and encounter is this like really screwed up relationship between this like kind of shitty, if like vaguely well-meaning young teenage boy and this like girl who's so obsessed with his approval that she kind of ends up, you know, sending him various videos and of her photographs of herself that like kind of for clout, kind of to keep his interest, and like they're both kind of performing a certain narrative. And this is like neither one of them sort of doing it out of a place of desire, but out of, like, coming from a place of, so we want this for social capital and we should want these things.
Right.
And all of the characters in the book respond to this, and to a greater or lesser extent, by being like, we're not sure what to make. Like, this seems bad. We don't want this. We don't know exactly why. And because they're teenagers, they don't exactly have the language to figure out what that means for them. Their explorations kind of come from this sort of same place of like, this is clearly not me.
Right.
Why? And I definitely see, like, Laura in my mind is absolutely like a lesbian character, and she is also a character who is interested in faith, and those things are both true of her. There, a character like Isabel, who is, similarly that.
Right.
Virginia doesn't necessarily know, or Virginia is something else that she herself doesn't have words for. But it was, I think, for me, there have been great novels about, like, particularly the queer experience, but like also a sort of feminist experience of repression and where religion kind of plays a role in that. For me, this was more about a kind of hunger that has no name and trying to find a name for it. I think, too, another way in which I think I for what it's worth, a sort of person of faith, I'm practicing Christian in a very sort of progressive and affirming parish, but also sort of have come from a sort of feminist perspective as well. And for me, the other point of contact is this, like, insistence on the full humanity of the other. That, like, there is something, like, within the Christian tradition, you might talk about, like, human beings in the image and likeness of God, and this being part of the sort of what it means to be human. Right. And where that, for me, kind of manifests itself in politics is, like, you have to, and also, like, as a writer, in terms of the commitments I have about writing characters, is like, to be fully human is to be, or to see someone as fully human, to offer the gaze onto someone of seeing them in their full humanity rather than reducing them to an object, to a set of qualities, to a reward for good behavior, as female characters often are. That pull, I think, this desire to be like, what does it mean to see someone as fully human, and what does it mean to not be able to do that, is a question that, like, interests me both from a feminist perspective and from the perspective of someone who's, like, interested in ways in which religion can, in some ways, offer this sort of ethical commitment to not do that, and often in the actual world historically has done the reverse. So I think all those true.
No, for sure. This is probably a good time to bring in a question from one of our viewers. Nafisa wrote, I really enjoyed your book, Strange Rites, and I'm looking forward to reading this novel too, and reading about your conversion to Christianity and some of your thoughts on complicating the relationship between religion and repression. I am wondering if you could say more about the conflict between certain kinds of Christianity and queerness.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's I think, obviously, within the, like, wider, like, very wider Christian world, it has not traditionally been the most, I mean, despite what it says on the tin, in terms of being welcoming, it has not historically been a home to marginalized people of, in a variety of regards, of which queer people is, like, among the kind of, against whom they have been some of the greatest defenders. And that's something that, like, it's a sort of constant consciousness that, like, you think about, like, it's easy to romanticize someone like Virginia talking about, like, moral realism and how we need that, and we need a real sense of good and evil, and if something feels good, that doesn't mean you should do it, and, like, kind of divorced from the actual practical applications. Like, all that seems well and good when in theory, and then I think that there is, particularly now in certain corners of the Christian right, a real synthesis of something that, like, a perfectly fair perspective, which is that there's a lot about the contemporary liberal capitalist world that is alienating, and ways in which, like, certain forms of, like, capitalist desire therefore things run unchecked might be critiqued valuably, which then sort of gets grafted onto this like Virginia-esque trad anti-modern, like everything old is good, everything bad and everything progressive and new is bad. If only we could return to the good old days, and it means this about gender norms, and it means this about sexuality.
Right.
And suddenly it's not about a critique of like specific elements of the world that we're in, and it more becomes this kind of fetishization of this imagined past that never even really existed, you know, people behaved a certain way and hierarchies were rigid, and then you end up with like a Jordan Peterson or a Peter Thiel or these sort of reactionary thinkers who have like in some ways reimagined Christianity as a culture war, like something that you can put in your Twitter bio if you want to be like a reactionary culture warrior, rather than something that I would argue was always intended to be transgressive and always intended to question and unsettle the people in power in every era. And, you know, like I'm obviously speaking from a place of like, you know, I don't like, we definitely have more queer people than straight people in our parish. And, you know, it's obviously kind of a little bit of a privileged position to be like, well, we don't do that. And I don't think any community that exists can actually live out, you know, like love your neighbor is one of those things that's so actually radical that nobody can manage to do it consistently for very long. But I do think that what drew me to faith as an adult was the way in which so the Magnificat, which is the based on this part from the Gospel of Luke that is now part of the traditional Anglican prayer cycle. It's this prayer of Mary. It's a prophecy that Mary is supposed to have received when she sort of learns that she is to become pregnant with Jesus, and she talks about like the mighty being cast down and the lowly being raised up, and the ways in which the kind of hierarchies of the earth and the hierarchies of power are complicated and indeed overthrown by a kind of vision of love. And that is absolutely a political vision. And that's something that I think maybe perhaps the characters in the book that aestheticize it most don't actually really pay attention to what it says.
That's fair. You know, I think it's interesting for people that are from Atlanta. We have a very unique perspective, I think, on faith sometimes because we grew up in the Bible Belt. There's a very different, I think, take on religion and the experience of religion and the impact of religion in the South versus the North, in ways where I think there's a different kind of give and pull that queer people can have with Catholicism and with the way it manifests in different parts of the country. I'm curious if you had any takeaways from sort of seeing how that regional difference in faith can kind of impact and play on people in writing this book.
I mean, I think the book sort of wouldn't have worked if Virginia had not been from somewhere like New York. So a bit of the background of I grew up in New York City, and I grew up in this sort of like culturally like mixed of sort of Christian-y, Episcopalian-y, but also kind of Jewish sort of mixed family where, you know, religion was there, but it was not something that like suffused one's life the way it does in, you know, in other parts of the country. And I would, you know, for me, therefore, this, you know, religion was something kind of exciting and different that I could sort of seek out, and to a much greater extent that like that part of it is of my own experience is reflected in someone like Virginia, who grows up also in a Jewish family, in a very liberal progressive family. And for her, like a conversion is like she's rebelling, like her parents are shocked, like she's reading Henry Kissinger, like her parents went to Woodstock, and it is very much, it's like the most sort of weirdly rebellious thing you can do in like certain like an upper middle class liberal urban enclave and yet I think it's telling that other character like someone like Isabel who grew up with her father who is also extremely religious and is also very homophobic. Like she's sort of like, why would you choose this for yourself? Like I've actually grown up in this is not just like a fun costume you can put on. This actually hurts people.
This is my real life, right?
Yeah. And I think that it was kind of completely necessary for me for the only characters who could conceivably like fetishize this are characters who can still deal in abstractions and aesthetizations and don't have to kind of live with the day-to-day reality of it. And I've seen like there are for all that I like personally think it's extremely beautiful when like I hear certain kinds of religious music. I used to live in the country of Georgia, which is sort of somewhere which is like extremely observant in many ways. Religion suffuses life there. Like fasting on your average Friday is like pretty done. Like restaurants have their Lent menu so that you can just like you don't even have to think about fasting, and yet you see the kind of sometimes there's beautiful things about that, and also then you see like Orthodox priests coming out and attacking pride parades in the capital of Tbilisi, and you're kind of like, yeah, once you see it in action, it becomes a little bit more difficult to fetishize something like the anti-modern as a phenomenon, even if you have like legitimate grievances against the modern world or the world as it is.
Right. And we have a comment from someone that says, regarding fetishization of imagined past, I dabble in and sympathize with critiques of modernity, postmodernity, relativism, but as a non-Christian, I often see these critiques from Christians that then tend to engage in exactly the kind of fetishization you describe, and it's so important not to be reactionary in these critiques. Thank you for your answers on this.
I mean, I completely agree. And one of the things that like, a question that came up, I had a conversation with a writer called Christopher via a few like last week, and something that came up in our Q&A was the sense of like, what are the problems of the modern world that aren't the problems of like human beings? Like our critiques that we level against quote unquote like alienated modernity. Some of them, I'm sure, like we can have a conversation about like the panopticon of social media and how that's made us like overly sort of self-conscious in certain ways. We can talk about like the gig economy. There are specific critiques we can level, and yet I think it's easy, like it's the kind of version of like the modern world is terrible and we should go back to the past. Well, first of all, there's this sort of obvious and I mean obvious but necessary answer that better for who and what does it mean to be better and protect for certain kind of people. But there's also the question of like, are there just like bad broken bits of human nature and ways in which we are selfish and ways in which we want power over other people that are not that like take different forms based on the exact situations we find ourselves in, but can be critiqued because we're critiquing like what it means to be human and ways in which humans can be messed up. And I think that while I'm always reticent because I feel like the language of sin is often like used and misapplied in my view to be like, thou shalt not that. One thing that I think that like the language of sin is often helpful for me, at least, is when I'm thinking about like those qualities of being human that are bad, like, or those qualities in being human that divide us from one another, the impulse to, be jealous of one another, to want control over another person, to kind of manipulate in certain ways, things like the kind of like, well, it's, it's human to do that. It's like, yeah, it is human to do that, but like, we should not. And that sense of how do you overcome the impulses in you to be a worse person? I don't want to speak for you. Like when I ask myself, how do I overcome my own impulses to be unkind or to be cruel or to be flippant? That is a kind of struggle that I don't think is reducible to like where I fall in the historical record.
For sure. Yeah, a little bit on that. There's a question here from Jindy. I love this book so much. I was a mix of Laura and Virginia in my misspent youth. Love it. In love with the aesthetics of Anglicanism, which I mistook for faith, whereas your story builds towards a genuine Christian love and grace, seeing people as a mix of good and bad. How can our faith communities do better at providing a sense of meaning and emotional skills to teenagers who find modern secular love and sex models to be alienating and commodifying?
Wow, that's a great question, and wish that I had I wish that I had a fuller answer to. I'd say that my instinct there is that one of the things that the church that I personally belong to, I think, does really well is it fosters an actual community, both in terms of the ways in which it kind of pushes for certain kinds of community service and community action, the ways in which the members of the church look out for each other. And, particularly, I think we saw that in the pandemic, that, we took care of each other, and that meant checking in on each other. It meant bringing each other food. And I think that, one of the things that communities can do well, faith communities can do well, is say, all right, like, we want to model a better kind of world, and that's just got to start with like being good neighbors to each other. And one of the ways I think that it complicates, like, often, like my church in particular, like a lot of churches, tends older because that's sort of the demographic. There are not that many people under 40, and at least in my case, a lot of Episcopal churches in New York. And then I think that sort of modeling of like what we can offer is a genuine way of dealing with community. And I think that becomes a model through which it becomes easier to like look at life more broadly. And I think that, like, obviously I love the music, I love the aesthetics too. Those things did kind of bring me in, and I'm glad that they're there. But I think that there is a danger, and I've seen churches do this, where suddenly you become the music church, and then it becomes purely a social event, and it becomes an event of like-minded people with a certain affinity who want to come to do this as like a fun thing. And that can be great because, it's wonderful to meet people who share your interests, but it also then becomes just another reproduction of the like same kind of marketplace that brings us in contact with people who share our interests in like every other facet of our lives. And I think the only way past that is to say, like, part of being in a community is like, checking in on other people and staying in context and forming friendships that are more unexpected.
I would say I'm thinking of a specific church in New York that you might be thinking of too, but I won't get into it. We spoke a little bit about your nonfiction work in another question, but I wanted to take this question from a viewer as well. Tara, you've previously written about cults and strange rites, your nonfiction book. Can you say a bit about how your nonfiction work influenced this novel?
Absolutely. So Strange Rites, for those who haven't read it, it's a study of the spiritual but not religious, but particularly looks at the ways in which certain phenomena, wellness culture is one example, interest in kind of magic and witchcraft as a kind of activist phenomenon, various ways in which people who are interested in and hunger for spirituality but are alienated from organized religion for a variety of reasons, marginalization being among the most prominent. So the argument that I have is that, like, we are not necessarily in a quote unquote secular age, despite being a quote unquote less religious demographic. What religion looks like for our generation, I'm 31, so particularly millennials and younger, religion looks a little bit different. And the takeaway I had from that is the way in which, gosh, everybody is so hungry. And everyone is kind of hungry, not just for meaning in a kind of personal fulfillment sense, but for a kind of moral certainty. And I think that there's often like a kind of claim made about, particularly Generation Z, that they're like so serious and they're kind of like frighteningly intense. They're all like baby Joan of Arc or what have you.
Yeah, we hear the word puritanical a lot, I think, with Gen Z. Yeah.
And something that I find really interesting about that, and that I tried to capture in these characters who are kind of a little younger than I am, a way in which this hunger manifests itself, and the way in which this hunger is both kind of a good thing at its core and can manifest itself in ways that are, in Virginia's case particularly, although she obviously chooses a very like not normative path for her, or outlet for this hunger.
Right.
But I think that I wanted to write about a group of people who are all looking for something and finding it in a different place. This is not just the story of like Virginia who wants transcendence, and that's so cool that she wants that, and a couple people who follow her, as much as it's a story about a whole group of people at the school. Isabel, who finds a genuine, I think, moral meaning in the activism she does, even if it's complicated by like the fact that it's also, you know, lesbian X drama playing out. As you know, but I think that it was, you know, I wanted to kind of make sure that everybody got a quest and everybody was finding what they needed in a different place. And if there's someone asked me at my event last night, like, why didn't we get a story from Isabel's point of view? And I think, you know, there's a novel where like a story from her point of view could just as easily have been touching on similar themes. And so for me, that was the kind of pull of writing a book about, I guess, children, teenagers, or children. Yeah.
Do you think that you would ever consider that novel? Would you ever write that one?
Oh man, I don't know if I'm ready to go back to St. Dunstan yet. I think that I would. There's a part of me that just wants to write from the priest's point of view. This like fed up 30-year-old who's just like just wants to have a quiet life, and these like insane children are being like morally intense at him and all, and he's just like, guys, just like go volunteer, just be like good people. So I think that I would be interested in revisiting this world, but I don't know. I think that rather than do either a straight sequel or, you know, the same story from a different character's point of view, I'd be interested in finding, in writing different characters' responses to it, or something like a little orthogonal to it.
That's fair. Well, let's take one last question from the viewers. Do you have a favorite cult or style of cult based on your research?
Oh, I do. I reported, but it was never published, an article on Gwen Shamblin and the Way Down movement, which WEIGH, which was a Christian diet movement that started in evangelical circles. That was basically like, God will tell you when to stop eating. And it started as this big thing in the 90s, and a lot of like churches had a way down class. And it turned out that basically, and I can say this now because the Gwen Shamblin, who founded it recently, tragically, she and several of the members of the church actually died very suddenly in a plane crash. But the piece that I had written actually just never saw the light of day because there were worries about legal concerns, because they had sued other journalists to try to write about them. But basically she lived on like an $8 million plantation outside Nashville, and everybody who was like really involved in it started like moving to be near her, and they were employed by her husband, and like their whole lives were about living around her church, living in accordance with her lifestyle. And all of the women basically were like working for free for this diet hotline, and were themselves like not eating and passing out from hunger because they were afraid to eat. And somehow like that community continued on for years and years. And I think I don't actually know what happened in the wake of Gwen Shamblin's death. But there is a documentary about it now, the Way Down, which I haven't actually, WAY, that I have not seen yet. I think it's on Netflix. So I think
I'm gonna check that out now. I want to know all about this now.
So yeah, it's I sort of put it away when I was sort of annoyed that I never got to finish my own piece, but now I'm ready to start again. So yeah, if you ever want to go down a rabbit hole, also she was like an extremely small woman, but her hair was like this big. She just had like this giant bouffant, and it was, I mean, she's just fascinating. So yeah, Way Down, Gwen Shamblin, if you want to just go down a Google rabbit hole for the rest of your night.
And I'll end with this question for you. Do you think in your writing about transcendence that you have found what it means for you yourself to find transcendence as a writer, as a person?
Oh gosh, no. Maybe. I think it's what I'm constantly striving toward. And I think that one of the reasons I wanted to write The World Cannot Give is that I felt like this was something that I'd lost. That there were moments in my life where I'd had it back, but I was not as susceptible to or open to the world as I had been as a teenager. And like, well, that was like probably a good thing for being a like generally healthy adult. There were ways in which I felt like, why can't I feel as intensely as I used to? And I think in the course of writing the book, and it forced me to be conscious of like my capacity for attention and ways in which that like I don't pay attention to things a lot. And I think I'm sort of instinctively like anxious person, and my response to being anxious is like to flip through my phone or to distract myself and to not be paying attention to the world. And I think something that this book inspired me to do and sort of made me conscious that it was a thing that I was doing is to be, gosh, to say being present feels sort of, feels sort of very vague and like an out. But I think to consciously cultivate like what it means to attend to what's actually happening, even if it's difficult or frightening or overwhelming, that's kind of the first step towards.
Especially post-pandemic, I would say probably, right?
Whoa.
We all kind of had to retreat away from everything to sort of find ourselves again. That probably is a big step.
It was, I mean, in that way, and this book was written during very much it was written in 2020. All 3 drafts were written in 2020, or 3 of the final drafts rather. And I think that's one of the things that was, I think, precisely by getting away from the world a little bit, for really awful reasons. I do think that there was a way in which that helped me be less distracted. And I think that my brain was sort of a social creature brain for a really long time, and not being in the New York of social creature, even though I was physically in New York City, did help me think through things in a way that was a little slower and a little calmer, and I think better for this book.
Very cool. I'll bring ER back, but we'll all give you a virtual round of applause and congratulations on your book. Yeah. And thank you all for your questions.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. I am sure folks who haven't read the book yet are totally ready and intrigued by now. So I want to encourage folks to click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen. That will take you directly to where you could buy The World Cannot Give from Charis. Yes, it's right there. It really does help us when you buy event books from Charis. So please do that. And also, I dropped the link to Strange Rights in there. You can also buy Tara's first book from Charis. Do you, Sarah Rose, want to share any links about where folks can buy your music? Is Bandcamp the best place, or is there another spot?
We're available on all streaming services, Spotify, Apple Music, and we're also available on Bandcamp as well. And you can find us in any place where awesome music is sold.
Cool. Well, folks, check that out. If you don't know her music, it's great. Their music, it's awesome. And I just want to thank you both so much for being here. This was a wonderful, deep, and thoughtful discussion. So, yeah, take care and stay safe. And hope that we will get to see you both in the physical store at some point.
Looking forward.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.